Hi again then guys, and welcome to the second to last review from way back in the 1.15 patch, which seems like a long time ago now that we're at 1.18, but of course it wasn't really that far back, about a month or so, and this vehicle is the second Super GT car that we're going to take a more in-depth vacuum approach to, if you will. Just look at it in its own way. We already of course considered it in the direct rivals match against the Nissan and the Honda, but just like with the Nissan review before, we're going to break it down in its own way, because we've seen to some degree how it reacts with the other two cars. Very competitive, all three of them are, with different drivers. You get different outcomes, each have their personal preferences, and for good reason. The three cars are very well matched, but also very different. And for me personally, I found the Lexus to be a very pleasant surprise. And also, one of the things that I like the most about this one is that, for me at least, it has kind of a middle ground between the NSX and the GTR, because something that I've mentioned about the R35 in particular a number of times is the sheer physical size of the car, and how even if a vehicle isn't heavy, being large can still be a disadvantage, because it just takes up so much area on the track. For instance, if the Jay Leno tank car weighed 500 kilos, if that were even possible, it would still be difficult to drive because it's just so big. It almost is irrelevant of weight when you get a car that big. Likewise with the GTR, some of the, for instance, touring cars or some of the GT3 cars on Gran Turismo 6 were very, very big cars. They're tall, they're wide, they're chunky, and they also, more often than not, feel heavier than they actually are. For instance, the Team Scholl's Motorsport GT3 car on Gran Turismo 6, if you compare that, for instance, to the BMW Z4 GT3, they're both GT3 cars, they both weigh the same, but they really don't feel that way. The Nissan feels like a much, much heavier machine because it's larger and it displaces its weight over a larger area. That can sometimes make a car like that feel cumbersome. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned before, I believe it was in the Rivals match actually, that I do like about this new Group 2 Nissan is that it feels more compact. The body kit is not quite as large. And that goes for all three vehicles. The body kits almost feel like they're extending out lengthways rather than widthwise. Now, in the case of this Lexus, the thing that I was saying that I like about it is it almost feels like kind of a performance middle ground between the Honda and the Nissan, because it's more compact and certainly more nimble than the Nissan is, but at the same time it has the more Nissan approach to performance and in particular to handling than the Honda does. And the fact, of course, that both the Nissan and the Lexus are front engine, or front mid, you could say, I believe they are, with rear-wheel drive, of course, whereas the Honda is traditional mid-engine behind the driver, it gives it a completely different handling signature. And of course, I've discussed before that I'm not a huge fan of the NSX race cars, I'm much more of a fan of the road car, and funnily enough, likewise with the Audi R8, I prefer the road versions to the LMS race cars. Now, in the case of this Lexus, it really toes the fine line, and not many cars can do this actually, and it's kind of impressive that it managed to beat the GTR at its own game, is that it manages to be both extremely competitive. It truly is a very, very fast car, but at the same time, it's extremely forgiving and very, very beginner friendly. And as I think, if I recall correctly, I mentioned in the review for the R35, the GTR, the entire lineage of the GTR, but especially from the R32 onward, it's known for that, for being a car that is not only dominatingly quick under most circumstances and forms of racing that it's in, but it's also very easy to use that kind of performance. Very few other cars can boast that. The Porsche 911 Turbo has occasionally come close in terms of how accessible its performance is, especially around the 997 shape 911 Turbo, but this car actually gives it a great run for its money. Now, the road-going version of the RCF, well, of course, it doesn't compare to a GTR at all. It doesn't stand a chance against one. But in racing, when they have similar specs, it's very reassuring from a performance point of view to see just how capably Lexus developed this car, because it's brilliant. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Lexus, I'm pretty apparently not a fan of the RCF in general. I find it to be a kind of bland car, to be honest. But this one, it's a pleasure to work with, it really is, and if a non-fan can say that, it gives you some idea of how good it could be if you already are a Lexus fan or an RCF fan. Now, as far as the engine size, as I've said before, all three vehicles are 2 litres apiece. They are slightly different in terms of once you get down to the CC, and we discussed that in the Rivals match, but they're all 2 litres, that's what the important thing is, of course. The power on this one is quite high. In fact, it's the highest of the three, as standard, 614, and it puts out 434 pound-feet of torque, which is incidentally the exact same as the Nissan, but both of them, this and the Nissan, have quite a lot less than the Honda. Now, the weight on this car is very good, again, lower than the Honda, the same as the GTR, 1,020 kilos, and consequently the horsepower per tonne is just a little bit higher than the R35 at 602 to that car's 600. So, I mean, they're pretty close. It's not like you can really notice 2 horsepower per tonne of difference, or at least most drivers probably couldn't notice that. Now, as far as pricing, of course, again, all 3 cars are the same, and that's exactly the way that you'd want it to be. That's pretty much the way it's always been. Most, if not all, GT500 cars, of course official ones if you exclude stuff like the stealth versions or base models, have the same or similar prices. And the prices have varied back in the older days of Gran Turismo, when I think they were something like 750,000 for the Supras and the Skylines. Then later on, I think there were 850,000 on Gran Turismo 6, possibly, if I'm recalling that correctly. And now they've got this base price of 800 grand, which is right in the middle. I would say 800 grand is brilliant value for a car like this, because this car in particular, for me, and my driving style at least, but also definitely the GTR for many people, and certainly the Honda for people who fancy the more mid-engine approach with a slightly slipperier tail, and, well, many people do just prefer the handling style of a mid-engine vehicle. Ferraris, Lambos, NSXs, Audi R8s, and that's fair enough, they're highly competitive. All 3 of these cars can genuinely take on anything in any of the other classes below them, and also quite a few in the classes that are even higher. Now, don't expect it to wipe the floor with an LMP, but for certain drivers, especially less experienced ones, you might actually end up being quicker in one of these Super GT cars around a certain track than you are in a prototype, because obviously a fully experienced driver will always get more out of a prototype as long as it has a good enough spec. But for a beginner, the great thing about these cars is that they have such accessible performance. It's so easy to drive the car fast and to put down a great lap time, whereas with a prototype, you have to focus a lot more. That's a simple fact, and even more so with a formula car like the F1500 TA. So overall, any of these 3 Super GT cars are certainly worth a look. I would say that the GTR is the most beginner-friendly, the NSX is the most pro-friendly, and this Lexus is kind of the middle ground between the two. It's as fast as the other 2, but it's also easier than the other 2, I would say, or at least on par with the GTR. So overall, certainly worth giving it a look, and it's a great car. But that's it for this particular pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.